So yeah, before I get into damper specific in iRacing, I want to show you how the basis of how a damper works. So this is a mountain bike damper. By the way, dampers are also referred to as shocks. As you can see, the damper is this bit and this piston, and this is a reservoir that's part of the damper. Um, and basically what the damper is doing is it's going to control how fast the spring compresses. Um, so in the case of a car, this would be one of the corner springs like we talked about in the last video. And all the effects that has on a car's behavior and how important that is. But yeah, so it's like the shock is affecting how quickly that spring is compressing or expanding. So here's a cross section of a, a damper. It's not the same damper design, it's a little bit different, but I just found it should be a good example. So um, this part of the piston is going to be attached to the spring, and when the spring compresses, the piston is going to move in, and likewise, when it expands, it's going to move out. So within the damper itself, there's going to be fluid. It's basically it's called damper fluid. It's basically like an oil. Its its job is to provide resistance to the piston, right? So how much resistance comes from the fluid determines, um, how quickly the spring compresses and expands. So, um, and different dampers have different ways of doing this, but basically you would either, um, block off more passages to make it harder for the fluid to go through, or you would tighten up different clearances or expand different clearances to vary basically how much area the fluid has to bypass the piston, and that'll determine how easily the piston will be able um, to go through the fluid. So uh, in terms of how this relates to the car, right? This is going to control um, two different aspects. So and we're going to call those low speed and high speed compression and rebound respectively. So as you can see, the Dallara IR18 has four-way adjustable dampers. You can adjust low speed, high speed, compression, and rebound for each corner. Rebound is the damper, or sorry, the spring expanding, and compression is the spring, compressing. Compression is also referred to as bump by some people, and also on some cars in iRacing you'll see it labeled as bump. So and you also see other cars have low speed and high speed tied together, so you can't independently adjust them, which is a lot more, there's more limitations with that. But anyway, so a low speed behavior in terms of dampers is any, it's basically a conventional sort of like weight transfer of the car. So as I was talking about in my driver feedback video where I sort of walk through the different stages of a corner, this could be anything from initial brake application where weight is shifting forward. This could be turn in where weight is shifting from side to side in the car, roll. It could be initial power application, where you're just getting on throttle and the weight's shifting backwards. Those are the main few instances. We'll get into more of them, as we go through it, but basically those are going to be your low speed behavior, is just your typical weight transfer. Um, that's a lot more intuitive to think about, I think. High speed damping relates to curbs and bumps, so basically any really fast like jolt to the suspension. Um, and like I said, the damping is just controlling the rate at which the suspension compresses and unwinds. So Um, yeah, and as a result, dampers really only have an effect, besides, they really only have effect on transient behavior, whether that's over a curb or a bump or in weight transfer. Changing dampers is really not going to affect steady state behavior at all. Um, so, so I'll start um, by saying I'll include a link to a good article that explains how shock histograms work. So shock histograms are a way in log data to view what proportion of time is being spent at different uh, different shock frequencies. So it's basically a way to determine how much time you're spending in each of the four phases: low speed compression, high speed compression, low speed rebound, and high speed rebound on each corner. For a particular car, you can find empirically, like through testing, that you might have a certain ratio of compression to rebound that you shoot for. Your high speed to low speed um, ratio is going to depend on what you define as the threshold between low speed and high speed, which is sort of arbitrary because we don't actually have the shock specifications, so we can't say precisely what that threshold is. Um, however, so just keep that in mind. But if you didn't understand that part about shock histograms, that's fine. I'll give you the article to read if you want, but you can also completely tune shocks by feel and get pretty close most of the time. Um, so really the main time I use shock histograms is if a lot of weird stuff's happening and I'm not sure what's happening, or I feel like the dampers are way off or something like that. If I'm just tweaking and I'm not trying to make fundamental changes to the dampers or to the setup, I'm not going to look at telemetry most of the time. I'm just going to go off of driver feedback. Um, so, yeah. So low speed compression at the front is going to control how quickly the front of the car squats down. So this is mainly going to happen in initial brake application, where all the weight's shifting forward. This is also going to happen, so let's say you're entering a corner and you get off the brakes, but then you realize, you need a little bit more brake to make the corner, so you add a little bit of brake back in. That's also going to be low speed compression in the front. And likewise, if you jab the throttle, right, when you release the throttle, that'll also be low speed compression in the front. So these things are sort of tied together. So at least in terms of pitch behaviors, so obviously pitch is the car squatting backwards or forwards. It's just diving forwards or squatting backwards, I guess would be how you say it. So low speed compression, right? If you adjust how fast the front goes down, that's directly tied in terms of behavior with how fast the rear goes up, right? So for this particular behavior of how fast the car is pitching forwards, you could adjust either one and potentially have positive effects if you're going in the right direction. So I'll give an example of a problem you might have here and what you would do to fix it, right? So let's say when you initially get on the brakes, you're having trouble with the fronts locking. And there are other ways you could potentially fix this, like weight distribution, rake, spring, stuff like that. But if you want to fix it, try to fix it with dampers, right? If you're getting front locking on an initial brake application, that would mean you're not getting the weight to transfer forwards fast enough. So you want to try to get more weight on the front tires quicker so you don't lock up. So in this case, you would want to reduce the amount of damping, either in low speed compression on the front or low speed rebound on the rear. So to reduce damping, you go more negative. So more negative is less damping, faster movements of the springs. Likewise, more positive is more damping. So everything's going to be stiffer and slower. So people might also say, yeah, stiffer dampers, which is going to be more damping, so more positive. Um, people might also say softer dampers, which would be more negative, less damping. So in that case, I would probably, you could either take out some low speed compression or some low speed rebound. Uh, so there's a couple things here, right? So first, how much to try? With low speed dampers, I typically it's pretty easy. Not easy, but it's a lot more sensitive to changes. So normally I only go 2 or 3 clicks at a time, particularly if I know I'm close to a setup I like in transient behavior. I'm not going to make a big change. I'm going to maybe make 2 or 3 clicks, right, at most. Um, enough to where I can feel the change, but enough to where I'm not just gonna overshoot, right? However, if I'm at the beginning of the setup stage and I'm really searching for a lot, I might go a lot more, right? Like 5 clicks, just to make sure I can feel the difference and see, okay, is this the right direction or not? The other question would be, so how do you know whether to do compression or rebound? It depends. So sometimes it might not matter, right? Other times you just have to consider a couple things. One, the compression rebound split of each end of the car. So this is one thing you can see in shock histograms, typically what the optimal ratio is, but a lot of times weird things happen. Basically, if you have a like really stiff rebound and really soft compression, it uh, particularly in roll, because you have to think about it, right? So the dampers. So obviously I gave an example in pitch, but the dampers are also acting in roll. So when the weight transfers side to side, and an example with roll where you might have to consider that is, let's say the front is more responsive than the rear when you're turning into a corner. If I already have a more responsive front, that means that it's less damped. So that'd be the effect of more negative clicks. So if I already have a more responsive front than rear on turn-in, if the rear feels sluggish, and I'm also having this initial brake application problem that I was talking about, where I would want more weight to shift forward, then because I don't want to, if the front's already responsive, I don't want to make the front even less damped, where there would be a bigger ratio of damping between the front and the rear, right? So I might, in that case, want to, take damping out of the rear. And so think about it. So in terms of pitch, so forward and backward movement, the front compression is tied with the rear rebound because the rear goes up as the front goes down. Likewise, the opposite's true. Low speed rebound in the front is attached to low speed compression in the rear. In terms of pitch, in terms of roll, you're just tying the two sides together. So it would be low speed compression and low speed rebound for uh, right hand corners and the opposite for left hand corners. But realistically, on a road course, there's no reason for these two low speed compression values to be different because you're going to want the same transit behavior going right or left. So, um, yeah, and think about it, when you're going into a corner, um, as one side is going down, one side is going up. So, uh, they're also they're tied together. So basically, it's a pretty complex thing. But I would try one. If you're not sure, you can always try both, right? Both, like, so let's say we had this initial brake application problem. You could try taking out a little bit of low speed rebound. If it feels better, you could also try taking out some low speed compression and resetting the rebound to where it was, and then see if you can feel a difference. Sometimes you can't feel a difference, and sometimes you can, right? Um, and so the inverse, right? The inverse pair in terms of pitch, right? Low speed compression and low speed rebound would be any time where the car is squatting back. So the main example where you get a lot of weight transfer here is on initial throttle application, um, and that's really important, right? To get initial traction off the corner. So that's one of the biggest damper adjustments you can do is for initial throttle application. But it also applies to when you're getting off the brakes. If you get off the brakes pretty fast, you can have, um, pretty transient behavior there. So that's another example of pitch in that way. Um, and I'll just give an example to make it make sense on how it affects the balance of the car. So if I have understeer on initial throttle application, so when I get on throttle, the car just doesn't rotate. Uh, that means I have too much weight going to the back and not enough in the front. So I would actually want to slow down that weight transfer, right? So, because let's just say the weight's fairly even and shifting backwards. And so then if I have understeer, it means I have too much weight in the rear in transient behavior. So I need to slow down the rate at which that happens, so I can keep less weight on the rear for longer, right? To get a little bit more rotation. So in order to slow down how quickly weight transfers to the rear, I would stiffen either front low speed rebound to make the front go up slower, or stiffen rear low speed compression to make the rear go down slower. The opposite's true if I have oversteer on initial throttle application, which obviously, so all these parts of the corner I break down in the first video I did in this series on driver feedback. Um, if I have oversteer in that initial throttle application transient stage, then I would want to do the opposite, right? I would want to have the weight shift to the rear faster, so I'd want to either take out damping from low speed compression or from low speed rebound in the front. Low speed compression in the rear, low speed rebound in the front. So that's sort of the basics of how the low speed dampers are tied together. Um, and like I said, it's a balancing act, right? Because there's a few things going on. One, there's the pitch interactions between low speed, the rebound and compression pairs, front to rear. Then there's the side to side, the roll damping that happens, when you enter a corner, and the ratio between how much the front is damped compared to the rear. Another thing here is that, as I mentioned in the previous video, your damping of a corner also depends on spring rate. So the stiffer your spring is, the less damping you're going to have. Um, Likewise, the softer your spring is, the more damping you have. So the slower weight will transfer with a slower spring, or weight will transfer slower with a softer spring. Sorry. Um, so a lot of times when you make a spring change, you might do it to make the rear less responsive or the front more responsive. But sometimes if you want, let's say, to go to a stiffer spring just for the aero platform, but you want to slow down the responsiveness of the front overall in low speed behavior, then you could go in and if you want to slow down, if you want to make it less responsive, then you would literally go in and stiffen all the dampers in the front, the low speed dampers, um, and maybe even high speed if you want high speed too, which I'll get to high speed in a minute. But so yeah, the spring affects the overall damping of that corner as well, in both low speed and high speed, in both compression and rebound. So it's everything. So the spring also, has an effect, and you might want to adjust dampers based on what springs you have. And that's another thing to keep in mind. If you have a huge difference in spring rate between front and rear, then you might have pretty different damper settings in the front and the rear to account for that, right? Not necessarily, but it might happen. Um, so that's something to keep in mind. Um, and another thing is, this is the baseline setup. You almost never have all your dampers to the same setting. That is not a thing. On ovals, you'll see a lot of times all the dampers are set to 0. Um, I have found some gains for messing with dampers on short tracks because there's a lot more transient behavior there. But really, when you think about it on a big oval, there's so little transient behavior. Most of it, you're either steady state cornering or just going in a straight line. So the dampers really don't do that much. Besides maybe interact with bumps on a high-speed oval, and then a lot of times we end up running them pretty stiff, basically to just keep uh, reduce variations in ride height is basically, I guess, the reason we do that. So normally dampers aren't really a big thing on the ovals. Um, but yeah, so now I'll go to high speed. So like I said before, high speed describes um, curb strikes and bump behavior. Bumps isn't like bumps in the road, not necessarily compression. It's both, right? So when you hit a bump, um, there's sort of 3 ways to decide to describe what happens with this spring and damper and wheel system. So you can either have an overdamped system, an underdamped system, or a critically damped system. So in an overdamped system, that means you have too much damping, right? And that would mean that when the wheel hits the bump, it's first going to be pretty stiff, so it's not going to absorb the bump very well. And then secondly, it's going to hang in the air a lot for a longer time when you are over the bump, right? So you're going to have it's going to hang in the air more, right? And like I said, it's also just stiffer, so it's going to absorb the bump less. An underdamped situation would be where you hit the bump and you absorb it really fast, and you maybe you absorb it really fast, but that might change the ride heights of the car really fast, too quickly, and it could also um, basically cause an oscillation. So because you're not dissipating you're not dissipating energy. So like in the overdamp situation, a lot more energy gets um, dispersed by the piston having to work harder to push the fluid right through the damper. But in an underdamped situation, you don't have that, so you're keeping the energy in the wheel, and so it's going to be more likely to oscillate. So neither situation is optimal, and could cause unpredictable driving behavior over bumps. Because obviously you want to keep the wheel in contact with the road as much as possible, and both, being too slow to respond to the bump and too fast in response to the bump can cause problems. So really, when it comes to curbs and bumps, there's a balance, right? And you're not going to want the same frequency for all bumps and curbs, right? So really, this is just going to be a big compromise. Fortunately, normally when it comes to like things like track surface, tracks are normally fairly consistent in terms of what their bumps are like and also what their curbs are like. So normally you can tune these pretty well for a track. But I would say that high-speed dampers are almost all a feel thing. You just have to feel whether it's better over the bump. And sometimes it's very hard to tell whether something is overdamped or underdamped, so whether you need to take out or increase damping in high speed for a particular end of the car. So really, you just have to try one. So if I think the front is like, if I notice I'm going over, I'm turning into a corner and the front washes out like as I hit a bump, and the rear seems to respond fine to it, then I'm going to try going both directions to see what happens. I'm going to try, taking out damping. And normally with high speed, I tend to make bigger changes so I can make sure that I feel the behavior, right? Um, so I'll try taking out damping, and then I'll try adding damping, and I'll just see if either feels better, and if one of them feels better, um, maybe keep going in that direction, or stay put with it. But either way, sometimes it's hard to say when you're driving, at least for me, if it's over damped or under damped, right? And uh, I should have mentioned, but critically damped um, means that something is essentially perfectly damped. It responds almost perfectly to the bump, so the wheel is basically in contact with the road all the time. That's obviously a really ideal situation, and it's not possible to have that happen for all types of bumps on a track. So, uh, yeah, another thing I should say that has a minor effect on damping, uh, especially for bumps and stuff, is tire pressures. So the stiffer your tire is, the more responsive it's going to be over bumps, and so the more tire pressure it has, the less tire pressure it has, the less responsive it's going to be. Just throwing that in there to point out that there's a lot of other things that affect damping, although I would say the main two things are obviously the damper settings and your spring rates. So, um, yeah, I'll leave it at that. Like I said, I'll attach a file talking about shock histograms, and feel free to do your own research on dampers to understand how they work, and reach out to me if you have any questions. I can either point you to someone that knows better than I do, or answer it myself if I know the answer. And I will say dampers are a pretty big deal on road courses. They're a big source of making your car drivable and fast. Basically, drivable, predictable, things like that. Um, and so basically, they allow you, if you have well dialed in dampers, you can get away with things like more front wing, like a more aggressive um, downforce split, to make the car rotate better mid corner if it's stable on turn in, right? With your dampers. So, dampers are really important to. Um, they're not the fundamental, like the fundamental things I discussed were in the previous video, but dampers are very close to being those things. They're like the next thing that, in terms of importance, they're super important.